Alright, how's it going, y'all? So I'm making this video to address probably the most commonly asked question on my channel, which is, hey, I want to buy the DS920 Plus. Should I buy it now, or should I wait for the DS922 Plus? And you can insert pretty much any single unit in there. So I wanted to talk about, honestly, what I think the Synology landscape is going to look like in 2022, and specifically what units they're going to be coming out with. I'm going to be focusing mostly on the DS units, because honestly that's where most people are going to be purchasing, and it also is where there's a lot more interesting stuff can happen because it's not got to be super standardized rack stuff. Instead, they can have a little bit more fun with it and actually kind of market it towards consumers. All right, and so before we get started, I did also want to mention I have no insider information. I do have a contact at Synology, and Synology will sometimes send me stuff. All I get is their newsletter, basically. Whenever something is announced, they will send me the newsletter, and that's really it. So I have no insider information. I don't have any leaks or anything like that. That's not this video. This is just going to be what I'm hoping for and what I'm thinking is going to happen most likely. All right, and so now let's just first talk about what units are probably going to be in play this year. And it's really based off the fact that Synology almost always has a 2-year upgrade cycle for their NAS units. All right, and so because of that, the units that are by far going to be most likely to get an upgrade this year are going to be any of the units released in 2020. And so by Synology's general naming convention, anything that ends in a 20 will be probably upgraded this year, except for a few key exceptions like some weirder units that they may skip. And so another thing I do want to mention, upgrades always are not necessarily huge upgrades. They sometimes are honestly just modernizations, and that's really it. And so just because your unit gets upgraded like 6 months after you buy it, really does not mean that your unit is now worthless. It's honestly probably still good for another 5 years, especially sometimes they just give it a bit of a CPU bump when you're not even CPU bound in a lot of NAS tasks. So it kind of depends exactly on what you're using your NAS for and if these upgrades are going to be even worth it. And so the units that are going to be most likely to upgrade are honestly all right here. The DS922 Plus all the way to the DS1522 Plus. So I think that all of these are likely to see an upgrade this year, except possibly the Slim model right here, the 620 Slim. It could just be me not seeing them out in the wild and really ever seeing people with them. I'm not imagining that these things sell a ton of units. Honestly, I've never really gotten using the 2.5-inch form factor unless you're going all SSD, which I have seen before just because people want to be able to travel with these things. But it's just a weird form factor, especially how limited it is. If you're going to spend all that money on SSDs and then be completely capped to 1 gigabit, there's really, I just don't get what these are really used for. Because honestly, 6 bays is really not that slim. And when you're capped to that form factor, you can't even get that large of hard drive sizes. So the 920 Plus is probably going to be able to have more storage than it, and probably it is about the same width. So I've never really gotten these slim models. I mean, if you're getting a 2 bay, I could get that, but I don't get why they're trying to sell the 6 bay here. It also only has a dual core CPU, so it's really not any kind of powerhouse. This unit, I would not be surprised if they just killed off and didn't use anymore, because I don't think anybody's really going to be buying them. So then the rest of these 5 units are kind of paired off except for the 1520 Plus. And so there's the 2 bay versions where you've always got the good and better versions. So the 2 bay, it's the 220 Plus and the 720 Plus. Basically, they're both 2 bay units, but the 720 Plus has a little bit better CPU, the ability to add NVMe caching, and also having an additional expansion port. Though, why are you buying a 2 bay NAS if you need the expansion port for 7 bays? Just buy a larger NAS to start with, but it is actually the unit I purchased for my very first unit right here. It was actually the 718 Plus, so I guess I can't complain too much. It started me all on this track. And then there's also the same thing with the 420 Plus and the 920 Plus. So the 420 Plus is a great unit, 4 bays, but it doesn't have as powerful of a CPU as the 920 Plus, though it still does have NVMe SSD caching. They both do have that. So I think that they can further change these units, specifically with 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. And that is the thing I'm hoping for by far the most on these new models, because they have not upgraded their Ethernet port on the back of these things in so many years. Especially as time's been going on, honestly, a 1 gigabit port on a NAS is by far going to be the limiting factor for how much you can do it for 95% of users' workflows. Most users are just going through, and when they feel the NAS is slow, it's because it's not copying bunches of files back and forth super easily. And generally, that's because it's limited to a 1 gigabit connection, which is 125 megabytes per second. So I do also run into a lot of users who are going over Wi-Fi, and so you're not going to notice a difference between 2.5 and 1 gigabit over Wi-Fi. I mean, maybe if you're right next to a Wi-Fi access point that's 2.5 gigabit, you might be able to do better, but you're not really going to actually feel any difference between those two with a real workflow at all with Wi-Fi. You just aren't. So I'm really hoping that the 722 Plus and the 922 Plus, if those do come out, I'm really hoping that they have 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports instead of 1 gigabit Ethernet ports, because I think that can just unlock so much more potential for these NAS units. And from what I've heard, it is dirt cheap to upgrade from 1 gigabit to 2.5 gigabit on the back of these units. I mean, you look at what Asus Store is doing. Asus Store is shipping some of their base models with 2.5 gigabit, and it really is a huge difference. It doesn't matter that much in a lot of these cases that you have NVMe SSD caching unless you're running like a web server on these things, because your slowdown is really going to be almost always based off of that gigabit Ethernet port. So I think Synology really has the perfect opportunity there to upgrade these units to 2.5 gig. I'd love to see them upgraded to 5 gig, but that's probably past what they do. There's not that many 5 gig consumer devices out there, and the switches are even hard to get right now. But 2.5 gig is really coming to be a standard across a lot of things. You're starting to see it shipped in laptops, you're starting to see it shipped in motherboards all the time because it's so easy to upgrade to that. Now there's actually a lot of infrastructure, there's a lot of switches that you can purchase for this 2.5 gigabit standard, which is a great upgrade path. It's 2.5 times faster than gigabit, all just for a very small amount of money. And the other thing is 2.5 gigabit can run over standard Cat5e cables, which is one of the real advantages. You don't have to recable a lot of these houses to go through and take advantage of faster standards. I think it also is just a lot easier to produce those units because it doesn't have to do nearly as much denoising as the 10 gig standard is. And so I really think that 2.5 gigabit is a great place. And I think honestly, if Synology does not take advantage of how cheap these 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports can be, I think they could fall behind because, I mean, another 2 years would have to go by to get that upgrade to these units. And I do think it would start really showing, especially when everything out there is 2.5 gigabit for these NAS units. And you're already paying a premium to get the 920 Plus, to get the 720 Plus, because you've already paid a premium over its baseline Plus unit. The one thing that makes me kind of hesitant to really think that you're going to actually do it and actually add these ports in there is the fact that that would cause a little bit of market segmentation. And I guarantee they are doing this research on, hey, if we ship these units, are we going to sell more or are we actually going to make less because people are going to start buying these units over things like the 1621 Plus. The 1621 Plus right here is actually the cheapest unit you can buy right now that has faster than gigabit speeds. And it is a fair amount more than even the 1520 Plus. And so because of that, I guarantee they're seeing a lot of people purchasing up to the 1621 Plus, not because they necessarily need that amount of storage, but because they really need faster than gigabit, because that's what you feel. And so I do wonder, and I'm guaranteeing they're doing the math on, hey, is it going to be worth it in the long run? Are we going to end up selling a lot fewer units of the 1621 Plus because people now don't have to upgrade there? So they're definitely doing that math. I really hope that they end up saying, yes, we need to add that 2.5 gigabit because they could lose market share because people might go, you know what? If they're not going to upgrade, I'm going to go over to QNAP. I'm going to go over to Asus Store. I'm going to go over to TrueNAS. I'm going to walk away to a standard that will actually give you better hardware. Now, they still do have the advantage of having by far the best software out there. I've tested out pretty much every single NAS operating system at this point. Synology DSM is just leagues above everything else. It is just super intuitive. It's got unbelievable backup packages. Everything is just so easy to work on there that they really have that advantage in being kind of the best in the game right now for a easy, intuitive NAS, which is what a lot of people honestly want. QNAPs do have a lot more power under the hood for $1, but the thing is QNAPs are getting so many security vulnerabilities and so many issues have happened where ransomware is happening, not because a user did something stupid, but because QNAP left a hard-coded password. There was a vulnerability they didn't fix soon enough. There's been so many of those instances that I really can't recommend QNAP, even though you're going to get way more hardware, way better hardware for your dollar. You honestly, if you're going to go for QNAP, I would recommend just formatting the thing, and I believe you can still install TrueNAS on there if you'd like to. And I think that way you get better hardware with a secure operating system, but you're not going to be able to open it up to the internet like Quick Connect allows you to. That's just not what TrueNAS allows you to do. And you definitely should not be doing that on QNAP until they really get their stuff together, because there's been too many instances of security vulnerabilities that have just caused actual ransomware attacks on people who otherwise had a pretty secure setup. The only reason I would ever open one up to the internet is if I had a VM running a VPN server, and that's it. That's the only way I would allow access outside of your local network to a QNAP until they get their stuff sorted out. So because of that, Synology honestly has, in a lot of ways, the market on lockdown, which while it's very nice that they have a great NAS operating system, does tend to stifle growth because you can end up charging more. You've already put all this money into this awesome NAS operating system. Now you start to profit off of it. So I do hope they don't just sit stagnant and wait for somebody to beat them and then play catch up, because I think a lot of companies end up doing that because that's just how markets grow. And at the end of the day, somebody will go, well, they're charging this much and they've only got this hardware. Well, let's go through and really beef up our system and actually be able to be competitive with them. I think if Synology does not add 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports to at least the 1522 Plus and hopefully the 922 Plus, I really think that that is going to cause these units to honestly kind of be old. They're great units, they've got a lot of power, but you're definitely going to start seeing them slow as in 2 years from now, a lot of just standard switches are going to be 2.5 gigabit. I mean, they're not going to be as cheap as gigabit ones, but it's going to be much more common in the home, and anybody who's got a wired network will be able to take advantage very easily of the 2.5 gigabit standard and have 2.5 times the performance really for such a small amount of money in terms of hardware cost, because I do think that will really speed up performance. Now, one other thing is SMP multi-channel is coming to DSM 7.1, which should be released roughly about the same time as these units are coming out. And so what that will allow you to do is that will allow you to actually bond multiple connections together. So you could have 4 different ports on the back of the Synology, all 1 gigabit, and 4 different ports going to the back of your computer, and actually have a 4 gigabit connection. So have 4 times the throughput overall of the actual transfer. Now you can currently enable this in DSM, but it is not recommended. It is still running the regular Samba that says it is an alpha, and there's a race condition that is very unlikely, but can happen, that will cause complete data corruption silently. And so I would not recommend enabling that if you at all care about your data, because having the ability to write 2 times faster, but possibly corrupt all your data, should not be worth it for most people, unless you're just playing around and want to enable it. But I would really just wait for DSM 7.1 to come out with the full out built out version and not risk it. And so that would at least allow you to have faster throughput with gigabit Ethernet ports. But I really still hope that they'll add in 2.5 gigabit, because not a lot of people are going to be able to easily set up SMB multi-channel. It's really just going to be great for the enterprise units and the kind of home lab guys who are like, yeah, I'm fine running 4 gigabit Ethernet ports to my computer, I don't care. Or being able to do a lot more tinkering. It's not going to be for your average mom and pop who have a NAS. And then as for release date, I would have to guess for these units that it would be maybe about 6 months from now, maybe June or July. That's about when they were announced last year. Though the thing is, all these things I'm saying right now are such subject to change, because honestly, with all these shortages that have been happening, it would not be crazy for these things to come out and be 2023 models. Now, I don't think they would like to do that. I think that they could just rush out a product just to make sure there's a 2022 model, because they like the fact that their upgrade path is kind of staggered. So about half their units, I'd say probably of units you're selling, the majority of them are going to be these units right here. I see by far the most of these out in the wild. It's for what most consumers need. And so about half of those, probably 3/4 of them, are upgraded on this cycle, and then the other 1/4 of them are upgraded on the other year. You wouldn't want to just stagger your entire upgrade path all 1 year, because that'll just cause a ton of R&D issues, and there will be no options for people who want to buy the latest and greatest. And instead, they'll kind of have a curve where everybody upgrades 1 year and then nobody upgrades the next year, which you want to have just constant revenue whenever you've got a company like this. So they probably will try to stagger these out and keep these coming out in 2022, but they might not be as upgraded as one would hope. Now, if we go on down to the value in the J series, I have a feeling that they're just going to kill off the value series, because there's really, I don't get why there's the value series and then there's the J series. I think the J series is just going to completely take over the value series. I think they're just going to remove that. They might add a play version. I don't think they're shipping a lot of play versions, even though they probably could. So I do think that there's a decent chance that there's no longer going to be this value series, and instead they're just going to keep everything on the J series. And maybe they upgrade the J series this year, but maybe not. I mean, honestly, these units are kind of designed to be very, very, very cheap for them to produce and not have that great of hardware. And so you can make a lot more money if you don't have any more additional R&D costs. I mean, these units aren't super complicated to produce, but the fewer units you're having to produce and manufacture, the cheaper each one of them gets. And so maybe they upgrade it, maybe they don't. And even if they do, I mean, they probably will do similar to kind of what Apple does, is they'll just take whatever is in the 2020 plus line, so all those units we were just talking about, and just throw the hardware in to the J series and call it a 2022 model. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. I could just see them leaving these be, because really there's not a ton that they can do to upgrade these. They're designed to just be basic file servers. And so I could see them just leaving these for another year. Now, I will say I do see very few of these models ever out whenever I'm doing consulting or even in the comments. But then again, the people who are commenting on my YouTube videos, watching these videos, who are hiring me for consulting, probably are not buying the super simple J series models. They're probably buying more upgraded models because they want more of the features and things like that. I do think they probably sell a fair amount of these just because people hear, oh, Synology's great. Well, I'll just buy a super simple one and have a little home cloud. And so I'd love to see the numbers on these things, on how many of these units they're actually selling, because honestly, I have no idea. All right, and then there's also the good old rack mounted series, which I don't know how many upgrades there are going to be this year, because they've already kind of gone through and upgraded a fair amount at the beginning of this year. The FS series, they just added somebody to already. These things, honestly, I don't even know when they get released because they end up just being very long cycled ones. But if we go down here to the XS Plus series, they already went through and upgraded all the real enterprise stuff. This past year, they're all 2021 models, and I don't think there's much they're going to add into these. It'd be pretty unlikely. They might even kill off a few of these older ones. Now, the only one that's kind of up for an upgrade, if you keep with a normal 2-year upgrade cycle, which it does not hold as true for the RS series, those full-on enterprise series. Sometimes they're 3 years, sometimes they're 2 year. It kind of depends on what they're honestly doing and how many units they're selling. But the only one that would really be up for an upgrade would be this guy right here. And honestly, I could see them just killing it off. Not a lot of people are going to buy a rack-mounted unit. I've never gotten who's going to buy these rack-mounted units and only need 4 bays. I mean, maybe a basic file server for a business, but I really could see them just simplifying this line down to saying, okay, we're only going to have the 1221 plus models and just kind of kill off these 2 models, because I don't think they bring a lot to the table. I don't see a lot of businesses going through and just needing 4 bays of storage if they're already going to pay that rack premium. I think if you just need 4 bays, you're probably not even using a server closet. Maybe you are, and maybe you just put it on a shelf and buy one of the 4 bay consumer models, one of those like the 920 plus or the 922 plus if it does come out. That would be a great unit to stick in there, because I don't think these bring much to the table, especially when you compare it to the 1221 plus. But once again, I don't know Synology's numbers, so it could always change. And really, that's kind of it for these units. Really, I think the biggest and most interesting growth that we're going to see this year in products coming out, at least I'm hoping, is going to be in those DS series. I'm really hoping we see a 922 plus and a 1522 plus with 2.5 Gigabit Ethernet ports on the back, because I feel like that would just be a huge upgrade to actual consumer users that they have been putting off for a long time. I think that if they hold that off, the entire line is going to be about 2 years old, and they're going to have to do it for the 2024 models. And I think that that's going to be a little bit too late because I think the entire competition will have surpassed that already. And so in 2023, next year, you're going to be looking at a bunch of NAS units across different providers, and those units are all going to have 2.5 gigabit in the price point you're talking about, except for the Synology. So I'm really hoping they go through and will add that in there. Their hardware is already a bit slower than everybody else's, but I'm entirely okay with that because of how good DSM is. But they really, I do think, need to go through, and at least on those little bit nicer models, those top models should have 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. And I think that would make a huge difference. All right, well, that's gonna be it for this video. I'd love to hear what people are actually looking forward to in the comments below, because it's kind of hard for me to tell what people are actually interested in. Obviously, this channel does have a huge bias because, well, it's more of tech people who really care about, all the cool features on higher end units. But I'd love to see what people are looking for and what units they're currently doing and what it would take for you to upgrade. All right, have a good one. Bye.